What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Templar DPS. So Magplars are pretty much where they have been in the relative Magicka DPS pecking order compared to Dragonhold. And that's mainly because there weren't that many changes that happened between Dragonhold and Harrowstorm that really affected DPS standing too much. Yes, there were a few new sets introduced, and yes, there were a couple of balance changes, but generally speaking, nothing really altered the kind of playing field too much for Magicka and standing DPS. So where they've been sitting is pretty much exactly where they have been compared to Dragonhold. So like I mentioned in a couple other build videos, this build is going to be very similar to what you've seen in Dragonhold, maybe a couple of skills swapped out here and there, but other than that, pretty much identical to what we had previously. So just like the rest of our build videos, we won't be going over gear. That was reserved for the Magicka DPS gear video, so make sure to check that out in the upper right hand corner if you're interested in knowing what gear I'm running for this build. Otherwise, this video is going to be just about skills and the rotation. Let's go ahead and get started here with our skills, starting with our front bar. We have Elemental Weapon as our spammable. If you don't have access to Sigil Order line, which you need to have in order to use Elemental Weapon, you can use Force Pulse instead under the Destruction Staff line. Next we have Purifying Light. Really nice because the copy damage can now crit. That was changed a couple of patches ago, so it's now actually pretty strong. Radiant Oppression, also known as J-Beam or Execute. Always want to have that on hand. Blazing Spear. This was nerfed a few patches ago, so the dodge is actually fairly weak. So you can see here 778 magic damage every second for 10 seconds. Pre-buff, so pretty weak overall, but it's necessary for the Burning Light proc as well as the 10% additional crit damage that we get from the Aegis Spear line passive. So while we will be using it, it'll mainly be using it to proc the Burning Light passive. Next we have Inner Light for the additional Max Magicka, and then Shooting Star for the Max Magicka and Magicka regen. On our back bar we have Solar Barrage. This is for the essentially permanent in power, so our light attacks get a lot stronger when we have Solar Barrage up. Next we have Unstable Wall. You can also use instead the other morph, which is Elemental Blockade. That lasts for 14 seconds. You don't have to cast it quite as often, so it'll save you a little bit of magicka, so it is one option to help out your sustain. If you feel like you need additional sustain, you can run Elemental Blockade rather than Unstable Wall. Unstable Wall is the stronger morph, but again, sustain can be an issue for Magicka Templars, so Elemental Blockade is an option. Next we have Ritual of Retribution. This is a fairly strong dot here. Then we have Barbed Trap for minor force. You can also run the move Challenge Acceleration under the Sigil Order line if you have to play at ranged. Otherwise, stick with Barbed Trap here because it does use your secondary resource, so it doesn't eat as much into your Magicka sustain. Channeled Focus for the sustain as well as the Major Resolve. That's just a nice bonus. You're mainly using it for the additional Magicka you're getting back. And then Crescent Sweep in order to make sure we have the 10% additional crit damage. We will be using this as our main ultimate, but you don't have to use it as your main ultimate. You could use Shooting Star, or you can also use this Deathstroke Staff ulti instead of Shooting Star if you want to cleave rather than just raw single target DPS. So while we do have Crescent Sweep, and I will be using it during the ultimate parse, you might not necessarily be using this in an actual raid environment. It is really cheap to use though, and in terms of damage done over ultimate used, it is fairly efficient, but again, you kind of want just raw burst. Single target DPS Shooting Stars better. For cleave damage, you're going to want to run the Deathstroke Staff ultimate instead. Now if you want to run a shield, the move that I would remove would actually be Ritual of Retribution if you want a shield, and then you can put a shield there. So you can run the Light Armor Shield, which is going to be my personal recommendation. So either Harness Magic or Dampen Magic. You can use Radiant Ward instead. The shield that you get is not going to be quite as strong, but it does deal a little bit of magic damage when you activate the shield, so it might be beneficial to run, especially in trash fights, because each enemy that you hit with that damage will increase the shield size, but because it scales off of your max health, it doesn't actually give you that big of a damage shield compared to the light armor passive. So here you can see 3357 compared to here where you have 5596. So even with the additional percentages that you get for each enemy hit, it's still going to be weaker than Hardest Magicka and Dampened Magic. So it's up to you which one you want to run, but if you're just looking for raw shield strength, go with the Light Armor Shield instead. But that pretty much concludes it for the skill bars. Now let's go ahead and talk about the rotation. Go over to the 3 million dummy so I can demonstrate the rotation for you guys. So, unlike a lot of other Magicka DPS, a lot of our dots actually line up fairly decently well. So you have 10 seconds on Unstable, 10 seconds on Solar Barrage, we have 10 seconds on Blazing Spear, Purifying Light is 6 seconds, and then Ritual Retribution is 12 seconds. But we can essentially use Ritual Retribution in conjunction with Unstable Wall and Solar Barrage. They're close enough that you can usually just bind them all together. Barb Trap is 18, and Channel Focus is 20. So it's a little bit less dynamic, but it's still going to be some dynamicism involved, mainly because Purifying Light is 6 seconds. The good thing is, because it's on your front bar and not on your back bar, the only thing we got to really watch out for is just on our front bar, just to make sure to run Purifying Light when it runs out. And it is important to let it run completely out, so don't recast this early. If you recast it early, then you will not get the copy damage, so you make sure it runs completely out. So it does require you to kind of pay attention to the Purifying Light proc. Unlike Power of the Light, where you have a very clear indicator and sound to kind of notify you that Power of the Light went off, you don't have it with Purifying Light, so you will need to pay attention to the visual effects, as well as if you are running something like Action Duration Reminder or Srendar, pay attention to the tracker that you have. But rotation itself, I like to make sure you have Channel Focus down for the additional sustain, put down Trap, and then put down all your dots. You can see here a little bit dynamic, but you will always be able to pair Unstable Wall and Solar Barrage together. And again, you want to make sure to let Purifying Light run completely out before you recast it. There is a very small, very faint audio cue, but in an actual trial environment, chances are you're not going to be able to hear it over all the other abilities that are going on and all the other mechanics that are going on. So just make sure to keep an eye on your tracker if you are using one. That's one of the most important things. Now, when we start getting to lower health, there is an add-on called How to Beam, which you can use to let you know when you should start using J-Beam. It basically has 3 settings. So basically, if we go over to our add-ons, go over to How to Beam here, you can see here that you have start using your beam, basically stop using your spammable and just start using J-Beam here. Then you have just running Spear and Blockade, because Spear for the Burning Light, Blockade for the Maelstrom bonus, and then you have just use only J-Beam. So you do have a couple of options here. This is a little bit in terms of, it's actually an older version of How to Beam. The newer one also takes into consideration other dots that you might be running. But generally speaking, this is just sort of like kind of generically, you want to start using J-Beam instead of your spammable at around 35% health. Around 25% health, you're going to want to start dropping your dots. So I would start dropping Ritual Retribution and Purifying Light first. Make sure to keep Solar Barrage up because you do want to have it in power, so just maintain Solar Barrage, Spear, and Blockade. And then at around 15% health to 10% health, that's when you want to just start using J-Beam and just ignore everything else. So I'll show you guys what that looks like on the 21 million dummy parse in a little bit here. So that's pretty much what it goes. Now you will notice that I do not have Spell Symmetry on, and Magicka Templars, their sustain is pretty bad compared to some other classes like Mag DK's running the Asylum Staff and Mag Nightblades in particular. And that's mainly because Solar Barrage and Unstable Wall, these are all fairly expensive skills. If you're using Ritual Retribution, this is actually the most expensive skill out of the 3. So we will have to heavy attack here and there. In an actual raid environment, you will have better sustain options because you'll have things like the Massive Restoration Staff, Symphony of Blades, Hollow Fang. So you will get better sustain in a trial, so you might not need to heavy attack or run Spell Symmetry. But for a trial dummy, you are going to need to heavy attack or run Spell Symmetry in order to fully sustain a light attack rotation. We are not running Spell Symmetry, we're just going to do heavy attacks here for this particular parse, but you can run Spell Sim instead of Ritual Retribution for a dummy parse if you want to go that route. Another thing to make note of is the 21 million parse is not necessarily representative of your performance in Raid compared to other classes. The trial dummy is missing a couple of debuffs, things like martial knowledge, Zens, major vulnerability from a necromancer, and again, we are missing some of the sustain bonuses that would start evening out the sustain differences among different classes. So the trial dummy should be used to compare parses between different classes on the trial dummy. It should not be used as a proxy or as a replacement for trial parses. So just keep that in mind before you start going off about how trial dummies are not raid parses. We all know that. We're using this in order to compare it across different class parses. Let's go ahead and get started here with the 21 million dummy parse. I start off with Shooting Star, but from this point onward we will be using Crescent Sweep as our ultimate. We will have to heavy attack quite a few times in order to fully sustain the parse here. You can already see how low our Magicka is getting. Like I mentioned, Magicka Templars have one of the worst sustain among all the Magicka DPS specs. Heavy attack here. I don't really have any recommendations on when to heavy attack. If you need to heavy attack, I'd probably just use them whenever you need it. One thing you can do is try to kind of tie it, so to speak, to a cast of Purifying Light or Shards, especially if you're using Elemental Weapon as a spamble, because that will proc off of light attacks, so you make sure you're light weaving all the time. For example, I would use a heavy attack in Purifying Light rather than with Elemental Weapon. That way I'm not wasting my Elemental Weapon proc. Despite the fact that sustain is fairly bad, Magicka Templars are actually very strong when it comes to overall DPS. Gonna tie this one to our shard. We're starting to get that point where you want to use J-Beam. You're still maintaining all of your dots. You're just, instead of using Elemental Weapon, you're using J-Beam. So at this point here, we're dropping Ritual Retribution and Purifying Light. We're maintaining all of our other dots. Sitting at about 25% health. Once we hit about 10%, that's when we're going to start using just J-Beam and ignore everything else. Or I should say, we still want to maintain Rearming Trap, but that's pretty much it. So at this point, we're ignoring everything, we're maintaining Trap, and we're just using J-Beam the whole way till the end. So there we go, that is the Magicka Templar parse. So pretty strong. Again, the main weakness of Templars is the fact that your sustain is going to be a little bit worse. In addition to that, while J-Beam is a very strong execute move, it has a cast time. So it is limited, basically, I should say there's a channel time, not a cast time. Basically, you are limited based on the channel time. So it's a 2-second channel. So if you need to block for whatever reason, it's going to break it. You have less movement speed while you're channeling it. So it's not going to be the best execute in all cases. But it is a very, very powerful execute. So that is one of the reasons why Magicka Templars are fairly strong when it comes to ranged Magicka DPS. But in an actual raid environment, you might not necessarily be getting the same level of DPS from Radiant Oppression as you would like on a dummy. But you can see here we pulled just shy of 89k, 88.884k, almost all 8s across the board. Again, very, very powerful Magicka Templars in the right hands. But again, you are sort of limited based on the fact that you have really bad sustain compared to other Magicka DPS specs. And Radiant Oppression is a channeled, so you are limited. Basically, if you need to block at all. For example, Lakessi's hard mode and execute, you have constant meteors, so you're going to be blocking a lot, so you're not going to be able to make the most use out of J-Beam. So you are limited by the fact that your execute is a channel, but it is a very powerful channel nonetheless. But that concludes this build video. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.